We're continuing to investigate how government intervention in a market can actually impact prices. Remember, our main goal is to think about how markets create prices and how prices work as rationing devices. And in our current case, we're thinking about some forms of government intervention. Now, we've looked at direct forms of government intervention, such as direct price controls, price floors, price ceilings. We understand how that works. Now we want to think about taxes. In particular, we're going to think about something called an excise tax. An excise tax is nothing other than a per unit tax. Now, you should know that sometimes the government doesn't tax, they give subsidies. And the subsidies are almost always, again, in a per unit subsidy. It would just be the reverse of this analysis. Instead of putting taxes on the firm, the government would be saying, well, when you produce product, I'll actually give you some extra cash to do it. So it's kind of a negative tax, so to speak. Or you can think of tax as a negative subsidy. But we're going to focus on taxes right now, per unit tax. And so let's start by thinking about a market that's subject to a lot of excise tax. Let's say gasoline. So we'll draw our axis system. And on the axis, on the vertical axis, we put price of a gallon of gas. And on the horizontal, we'll put quantity. And quantity is measured in gallons of gasoline. Now, without government intervention, we have a demand curve and we have a supply curve, and that supply curve and demand curve will intersect at what we know to be a free market equilibrium. So what we'll say is that absent any government interventions, equilibrium is P0, Q0. Now, the government comes along and says, okay, I'm going to put, let's say, a $1 a gallon tax on gasoline. You hear these types of cases all the time. At least twice a year, some major political figure will actually bring up this type of action. Internationally, many countries have these types of excise taxes on gasoline. You know that if the price per gallon of gasoline is much higher in Europe than it is in the United States, that's because they have much higher excise taxes. And intuitively, you know, if we think about this model about the United States, if you were to impose this excise tax on gasoline, you could imagine that that's going to have some impact on prices. It's going to get more expensive. The real question is why? Okay. Earlier, in our course, we talked about the fact that unless government just dictates a price will not move unless one of these curves moves. So the question we have to ask is, well, what does the excise tax do due to this picture? And in order to think that through, we're going to take a step back and think closer about the supply curve. So let's ask the question, what is the impact of a $1 a gallon tax on gasoline, or how does the supply curve change? Because you know what? An excise tax is basically telling the firm it's going to cost you more money to produce that product. If you think about our supply curve that we drew earlier, we had some original supply curve, S0. And that supply curve told us that if you were to call out any arbitrary price, let's call that price P0, the supply curve would say at P0, you'll get Q0 units from the market. So in this case, it's gasoline. What happens when the tax goes up? What happens when the tax is imposed on this market? Well, let's just think about this in terms of putting some real numbers here. So instead of P0, suppose I were to say $2 a gallon for gasoline. And that results in some amount Q0, and I don't really care about that, but I'm thinking about the $2 per gallon. What that says is that the original supply curve told us that at a price of $2, firms will give you exactly Q0 units. If the price in the market had been anything less, firms would have sold you less amounts because it's just not enough money for them. If the price had been more, firms would have sold more than that amount. But at that price, they need $2. Now, the government comes along and imposes a $1 per gallon tax. That means that for this particular unit's Q0, all of the costs you had to incur yesterday are the same. You got to pay for electricity, you got to pay for the labor of the person who's running the gas station, you got to pay for the quantity of the product that's in the tank below your surface of your gas station. All of these things are the same, but now we have an additional $1 that I've got to give to the government. So I've got to pay all my other costs, labor, raw materials, all that, plus I got to pay $1 to the government. So if you still want me to give you Q0, how much are you going to have to pay me now? Well, you're going to have to pay me what you paid me yesterday, plus an extra $1. At this level, you would have to pay me that amount. In fact, it's the same at any output level. Yesterday, you could see that at this price, let's just call this price P0, firms at that lower price would only have given them this amount. But now that the tax is there, the only way we're going to get them to give this amount is if we give them that price plus $1, because now their costs are gone up by exactly $1, because that's what the government is telling them. For that particular unit of production, you owe me $1 too, besides the money you have to pay to the people who work at your gas station and to the electricity and all these other things. And so again, it's going up by exactly $1. And likewise, we could have picked another arbitrary price to begin with, something way up here at say $2.60. And if it had been $2.60 yesterday, they would have given you this amount. But today, if you still want that amount, which we'll call Q sub 260, you've got to give them that price of $2.60 yesterday plus the extra $1 of tax, because the cost for every single unit of production is now exactly $1 higher than it was yesterday. So what they would have supplied to you yesterday, they're not going to do it at the same price because costs are higher. Or if you want them to give the same amount, you're going to have to raise price by $1. And so to an economist, this excise tax will shift this supply curve up essentially vertically. The vertical gap at any price, at any quantity level, that vertical gap is exactly equal to the tax, which in this case is $1. Now we see the mechanism by which one of these curves is moved, so we can go back to our equilibrium and think about what happens when we have this excise tax imposed. We're going to draw a new graph, price on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal axis. We've got our original demand curve, which we'll label as D0, and our original supply curve, which we'll label as S0. And prior to the tax, we have an original outcome and original price. And let's just assume, for this example, that this original price is $2. So prior to tax, equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity is Q0. Now the government imposes an excise tax. You understand what that does. The excise tax just raises the cost of production. It makes it more expensive. So for any given output level that you might think about producing, you have to have more today than you did yesterday. You have to have more today than you did yesterday. You have to have more today than you did yesterday. Otherwise, you're going to be losing money. Graphically, we draw that by saying that the new supply curve, we'll call this supply after tax, has been shifted vertically by exactly the amount of the tax. This is the amount of the tax, which in this case is equal to $1. This gap is the same gap. This is the amount of the tax, which in this case is a $1 vertical gap. What's happened to equilibrium? Well, you can see prices have actually gone up. The new equilibrium will have prices here. Quantity demanded will have fallen. But note, has the price gone up by a full $1? And you know the answer to that is no, because you know by construction, this vertical gap is exactly $1. So this little distance here can't be a full $1. In fact, we know that by the way we built this, we know that at the original output, Q0, this height is actually $1 more, which would be $3 a gallon. So the equilibrium price hasn't gone up the full amount, and that's because of the curvature of these products. The excise tax does what? The excise tax on the product raises the producer's cost. No different than if wages had gone up or electricity costs had gone up. The higher costs means that the firm says, you know, I can't sell you as much as I did yesterday for that same price. If you want the same amount you had yesterday, you're going to have to give me a full $1 higher. Well, the market is not willing to give a full $1 higher because of the shapes of the demand curve and the supply curve. The result is some equilibrium price, which looks like it's about $2.45, which will clear the market. Firms are not going to give their stuff away. The excise tax raises their costs, and that means prices are going to have to go up. And this is how we model it, by thinking about how it impacts the supply curve.